Hello. Hello, my name is Franco Verona, and I'm the co-founder of Vintage Grail, and I'm the moderator for today's event. Welcome to Art, Time, and Passion, a journey into vintage Cartier timepieces with the proper gentleman himself, Harry Fane. Just a few lines about Harry. Harry really started his journey in Sotheby's, New York in the 70s, then spent a subsequent 2 years working in contemporary American art. However, after that, Harry's focus really shifted towards pre-1960s Cartier. And for the past 41 years, Harry has bought and sold some of the most beautiful and important jewels, art, and probably most important to this current conversation, watches made by Cartier. So Rob Report has famously written that Harry Fane knows more about Cartier than even Cartier themselves. Today, Harry has established himself as the preeminent source of all things vintage Cartier. So today, I think it's safe to say we are all in for a treat. Harry has agreed not only to share his time and knowledge with us, but to show us some of his favorite pieces from inside his showroom in London. Before we meet the man himself, I'd like to start this event with a quick video about Harry Fane.
To position Cartier amongst all the other jewelry houses is very simple. Cartier was always a leader. When Cartier first emerged onto the world stage, which was really about 1904, 1905, Cartier was the leader of the pack. First of all, Cartier was the best. So if you're going to buy a piece of jewelry, why not buy the best piece of jewelry? You'll see in here we have an eclectic collection of pieces. I have a big library. You will see in the library that there are many books on Cartier. When I started in this business, which was back in the late 1970s, there was not one single book about Cartier. If you had bought something in the 1930s, you would probably pay exactly the same amount of money as you would pay today. That's an odd analogy, but I know that we were comparing the price of a Cartier clock, which at the time it was sold in 1928 was the equivalent to buying a small house in New York. Now that clock today is worth $3 million. And a small house in New York is worth $3 million. There's a lot of glamour, a lot of drama, a lot of excitement, but through it all were these three brothers who were very determined to be the greatest jewelers in the world. And should they have come back today, we're now in 2020, more than 100 years ago when they started, I think they would be absolutely amazed at what they started and how it has grown into this worldwide known brand.
Well, what a great video. And now I'm sure that we're all excited to meet the man himself. So introducing here, Harry Fane. Hi, Harry.
Hi, Franco.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm excited. It's morning time for me, so it's good. Everything all right with you?
Everything's great. Luckily we get to cover 2 different time zones today. So great topic to talk about, time actually. Harry, I did want to kick off this entire conversation by learning more about you and the Harry Fane showroom. I mean, it looks beautiful. How long have you actually been in that location exactly? I think in the video you said late 70s, but what's the exact year that you moved in?
Actually, I mean, this is my second office. I started my life in an office in St. James's, which is another very niche area of London, and I was very happily ensconced there for close on 38 years when the landlord told me that he had sold the building from under me. So I was booted out. Everybody in the building was booted out. And it was a horrible feeling because we had a very nice office. And I've been here now, which is also a nice office, for I think 5 years I've been here. But I think that in my office, I think that I like nice things. I like nice environment. I'm dealing with beautiful objects and jewels and watches. So why not make a nice environment? So I try and make it homely.
That's right. So tell us about that a little bit more, actually. So what can one expect if one were to visit you in your showroom, in your second showroom today?
In my second showroom, well, I'm not quite sure what you would expect, really. But just in terms of my own personal taste, I'm fairly promiscuous. I am not in any way stuck in any one era. I have modern art here. I have 1920s sculpture. I have God knows what I have. I have all sorts of stuff, but I find it pleasing. And I think that as you talk to me more today, I think that what I'd like to explain to you, that for me, it's all about what I see and what I perceive as beautiful. And I think that I find everything I deal in, I find is beautiful. And that's my driving force, really.
Yeah. I mean, I just have to note that, of course, the showroom that you're in behind you, I mean, it just looks so comfortable. It looks like a great place to just sit and learn a little bit more about, well, I guess, soak in your knowledge about Cartier specifically.
I think you can be comfortable here. And I think that, I'm very happy. I love this subject. I'm very happy to talk to people. Sometimes I have young people who want to go in the jewelry business and they want inspiration. And I have people who are great Cartier collectors. We can sit here comfortably, drink coffee, and we can share ideas and share information. And the office actually is fine. It's full of little funny bits of Cartier memorabilia. I mean, as I reach out here, I don't know whether you can see. I have a photograph on my desk of one of the Cartier workshops.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So it's all. So there's lots of little bits and pieces like that, which people find amusing and interesting.
Fantastic. Well, of course, a lot of people will come to visit you, and the intent really is to learn about Cartier. You are very famously known as somebody who knows more about Cartier than Cartier themselves. So I got to ask, why Cartier? What was it about that brand that really drew you to it and excited you about Cartier?
Well, of course, it wasn't the actual brand. It's a word I hate, actually, brand, but it wasn't anything to do with the brand. When I started in the art business on my own, I used to buy objets d'art, different sorts of objets d'art, again, promiscuous, without any formality. And as I was looking for these objets d'art, I would quite often come across little things by Cartier, a little pillbox or a cigarette case or a clock or not actually jewelry at that point. Always objets d'art. And I liked them and I bought them. And after about 4 or 5 years, or less, actually, probably 3 or 4 years, I decided to dump everything else and just buy vintage Cartier. And we're now back in the late 70s. And in those days, it was still quite hard to find, but you could find it. I mean, you could go out in the markets, you could go out in the auctions, and you could find vintage Cartier. So that's how it came about. It was just an admiration for the beauty of the things.
Right. Well, let's learn a little bit more about Cartier. I mean, of course, over all these years, you must be, so knowledgeable about the history of it and the way it's, built itself to what it is today.
I should be. I hope I am.
I'm willing to bet you are. Tell me a little bit about that, right? So we know that Cartier is really known for, being a French jeweler, specifically to royalty and celebrities. But when did they actually start making watches?
Well, it all began in about 1904, and the story goes that the famous aviator, who was called Mr. Santos Dumont, who was in actual fact the first man to fly, and he was the first man to actually take off. So Alberto Santos Dumont, who was a great friend of Louis Cartier's, and he complained to Louis Cartier that when he was flying his rickety flying machine, he couldn't really take the hands off the wheel to dig for his pocket watch and look at the time and put it back again. And it was a worry. So Louis Cartier said, look, let's strap your pocket watch onto your wrist. That would solve the problem. And hey ho, there was the beginning of the wristwatch. And Cartier made the first watch, the Santos, in honor of Mr. Alberto Santos Dumont. Now, whether that is actually really fact or fiction, but it's a lovely story. And of course, in the early part of the 20th century, 1907, 1908, 1909, there was absolutely no tradition of men wearing wristwatches. Everybody wore pocket watches. Right. And it wasn't actually until 1935 that wristwatches overtook sales of pocket watches. And I don't know how much time we have, but when so it already begun around there, 1904 was where it begun.
Okay.
And went on to make watches, but the whole idea of strapping a little gold thing on your wrist on a leather band for a man was really radical and wasn't madly taken up, I don't think, to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, how much of that that movement from pocket watches to wristwatches can we credit towards Cartier themselves?
Well, I think that there were a lot of other people doing it at the same time. But if we believe the Santos Dumont story, then the whole thing begun with Cartier. But I think that there was definitely a movement going on at the time. I mean, ladies had diamond wristwatches, and they were very popular. But men had never worn it. And of course, one of the problems with a wristwatch versus a pocket watch is a pocket watch stays pretty firm in your pocket, constant temperature. On your wrist, you have heat from your wrist and cold air from above. And there were all these complications they had to overcome. But of course, it was at the birth of this tool that people have worn. They've only just stopped wearing them now with iPhones and God knows what. But it was an interesting time, and Cartier was definitely there at the very beginning.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about Cartier a little bit more in broadly and in general. So we're going to show a collection today later on, and in that collection we've seen pieces that have been inscribed between Cartier London and Cartier Paris. I mean, how did the Cartier family actually manage and distribute their timepieces across the world? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'm actually amazed that in the world we live in today that anything ever functioned in 1920. I mean, the idea that you had a shop and you had watches, but it did all function. And you see, all the mechanisms were made in Switzerland.
Okay.
Even from back in those days. I mean, in the very early days, 1904, 1905, they were making them in Paris, but basically all the movements were made by Mr. Lecoultre in Switzerland based on the design from Mr. Edmund Jaeger. But they shipped their watches. They sent them all over the place. But I think that Cartier was a great destination, a shop for people to go to, a destination. Mm-hmm. And so they shipped their goods, whether it would be jewels and tiaras or wristwatches or clocks. They had to supply their outlets, and there were only 3 outlets. There was New York, there was Paris first, London, and then New York. And those were the only 3 places you could go.
Right.
They were stuffed full of goods, and they moved them around. And but you mentioned London. I mean, London is another whole story, but it was one of the 3 places at that time.
Fantastic.
I have a London watch here, London-made watch. When we get to that watch, I'll explain to you a little bit about London and their watchmaking, because it was the only time that one of the branches branched out on its own and made designs of its own. Everything else, Paris, New York, and 90% of London things were always the same goods sold in Paris, sold in New York, sold in London. They were always.
No, that's actually interesting. I want to talk about that for a little bit now. So you're actually saying that there were London-produced watches specifically for the London shop?
Exactly. So what happened, as I say, is in Paris, and then it was shipped out to the 3 shops. So if you went to Paris or London or New York, you saw the same things. But in 1960s, in London in the 60s, the swinging 60s, it was a time of great creativity in London. Actually, it was all very much driven by fashion. And Jean-Jacques Cartier, who was running Cartier, he was the last Cartier family member to own one of the outlets, which was Cartier London, was very creative, and he wanted to participate in this era of mad creativity. He designed watches in London for a very short period of time, from 1964 to 1974, which have very distinct decorative features which are not found in any other of the Cartier shops. Now, these London watches in the last 10 years have become real hot property, and all the big collectors are desperate to get their hands on Cartier London watches. And I think that in the recent, last month or 2 months ago, one of the London watches, a Pebble, sold for $500,000 at auction, which is an absolutely astronomical price.
Right.
And of course, but the great cream, the great cherry on the London watchmaking cake was the Crash watch. And the Crash watch is one of the very, very few iconic watches which is known all over the world. And it's very interesting when I do shows, wherever they are, LA or Japan or wherever, the first thing people come and say to me is, have you got a Crash? And it's actually really annoying because I actually personally don't find the Crash the most beautiful of Cartier watches. It's definitely the most interesting, but not the most beautiful. But they all want to see the Crash. So that was the cherry on the cake of what London was making. And they made this very small production, probably only about 70 watches in all.
70 watches in total over those years.
In that 10-year period, as I said, and there are about 5 models which were unique to London. And I'll show you, just so I can explain to you the reason why they are unique. I'm going to show you 2 watches.
Please do.
Now, you can see, these are both Tank Normals. They're both more or less from the same period. And you see one on the right, this one here, you'll see that around the, inside of the numerals, you'll see a little minute track. And this was called a chemin de fer. Chemin de fer means train track in French. There was a little train track, which was the minute hand. Now, when Cartier came along, Cartier, first of all, he removed the chemin de fer. So 90% of the Cartier production watches have no chemin de fer. And as you can see, it creates a very, very clean aesthetic. The watch case is exactly the same. The winder's the same. The numerals are the same, but they just changed the signature. They gave an italicized signature. But it's just, it's a little sideline about Cartier, but it's very relevant today because everyone's talking about Cartier London and they're talking about the Crash. So that was the only moment in the history of Cartier when one house went off-piste compared to what the others were doing.
Right,
it was it was at the very end of the era when Cartier was one company owned by the family. By 1974, it was all dispersed and owned by different people.
Right, and I'm excited to see some of those pieces later on that we will look at actually. Before I ask you the next question, I do want to let everybody know that of course there is a Q&A box at the below. Please feel free to put your questions there for Harry. Please none for me, but all for Harry. And we'll make sure to or in the chat, so we'll make sure to address them as best as we can. Thanks. Harry, I want to go back to Cartier and the way that they've been designing watches. One of the most interesting parts of Cartier that I noticed was in 1998, actually, so a little bit more recent. But it sure seems like 1998, they had that collection that basically goes all the way back to the vintage models. They had a Tank Centré and a Tank Chinois. Why 98? Why all of a sudden in 1998 did Cartier say, let's go back to the Centré and the Chinois?
To be honest with you, I'm not really sure, but I was one of the first people. In fact, I was the first outsider ever invited to see the Cartier production meetings. Make for the next season, and the bosses have a chance to question and to change and alter. And I went, and I went. We finally ended up in the watch department, and I saw some of the watches that were being made. And I spoke to one of the people there. I said, "Why have you made this utterly hideous watch?" And the man said, "Well, it might be hideous to you, but it's not hideous to somebody in somewhere else. They might like it." I said, "But that's not the point." I said, the point of Cartier was always that people came to Cartier because if by going to Cartier and buying something from Cartier and wearing something from Cartier, you were elevated by Cartier's taste. By what you're doing is I said, what you're doing is you're kind of reversing the trend, is that you are making things to apply to the lowest common denominator.
Right.
And and I said, listen, you've got the best designs. Why don't you stick with them? Well, I was completely shut off and told I was talking rubbish, nothing about anything at all. But I think that Cartier over the last 20 years has begun to appreciate just how classic and how extraordinary these watches, which were designed by Louis Cartier fundamentally in the early part of the 20th century, are. And I think that with all the watch designs in the world today, has to be a personal view of mine, but it is, I do hear other people saying that. I think with all the different watch designs around in the world, when you see a Cartier watch, I think people do generally say, wow, that is a pretty watch, or that is an elegant watch, or that is a smart watch, or I'd like to have that watch. And I think that that was probably the driving force to drive them towards remaking some of their classics.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, now talking about personal opinion and talking about, somebody that goes to visit Cartier to elevate, let's say, their design. Let's talk about people that want to start their own collections of Cartier pieces. Where does one even start? What's the right model, the right piece for a new collector, a potential collector to consider?
Well, I think that first of all, that I don't think that it has to be exclusively for collectors. I mean, I think that quite frankly, one Cartier watch in your life is quite enough. I mean, I think that there was a moment in French history when it was sort of a rite of passage. When you were 21 years old, your father, if you were from some aristocratic background, your father would take you to Cartier and buy you your first Cartier watch. And that would last you all of your life. And it was enough. And I think that I sell just as many Cartier watches to individuals as I do to collectors. And there's only one thing that I would say is that you ask, where do they start? Where you start is by choosing a watch that you like. That is all that matters. It doesn't matter if it's the biggest, the smallest, the most expensive, the rarest, it doesn't matter. You're going to wear it. You have got to like it. And if you like it, that is all that matters. Now, I mean, I have people who come to me with their very small budgets. And I say to them, well, look, buy a classic 1970s Tank JC. It's one of the great classic watches. They're not expensive, but you get the look on your wrist. They still make them at Cartier today. They still look fabulous. And they don't cost a lot. Now I get other people who come to me and they have funds and they want to buy something which is really, really unique and special. The same thing applies. I say, look, you can have a watch here for $150,000 and you can have one for $15,000. Which one do you like? And quite often the people like the $15,000 one more than the $150,000 one. Right. So that's the bottom line. And I think that obviously to move into then the world of people, not even collectors, are people who want to have, have 2 or 3 Cartier watches. Obviously, they do come back to get something a little bit different, and they do look for the 1930s watches, 1920s watches, and on it goes from there. But I think this is you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, whichever looks best on your wrist at that moment, which one you like the best. Well, but then I do have to ask, Harry, what was the Cartier piece that you put on your wrist for the very first time?
You can see it's on my wrist now.
Okay.
It was a 2324 Tank Normal. And I like the strap, which is all beaten up, as much as I like the watch. But it's interesting you asked that question, because this is a medium expensive watch. But when I bought it years and years ago, it wasn't expensive. And fundamentally, I always end up wearing this one. And it's just that's it. I really like it, and that's all. I could go flashing around with one of these 1920s Centrays, and I do wear them. So I'm going out for dinner, and I'm suddenly in the mood. I go to the safe and take it on. But you say, which one is mine? This one is mine. Yeah. And this one I never sell. And everyone asks me, please sell it to me. And I say, no, you can't have it. But I don't know why. I've got a kind of an affection for it, and I think this is the other thing which I would like people to understand. I think that there is a great romance in owning a Cartier watch. And I think the way it looks on the wrist, the way you handle it, the way you have to set the time, wind it every day, you have a connection with it. This is not a digital watch, not even an automatic watch. You have to engage with it day in, day out. This one loses about 4 minutes every day. Every morning I have to wake up and reset it. But it's a part of the romance. It's a part of the relationship you have with this particular timepiece.
And it says a lot, by the way, that you have, let's say, I can see tens of other Cartier watches in front of you today, but you have the first one that you ever wore on your wrist. And we didn't plan that, by the way. We didn't plan for me to ask you that. So that this is
no. And I should probably have said the most expensive one here is my favorite one, but I'm being frank. But there are a lot of watches in here. I may add though that when we were setting this up.
Yeah, let's actually take a look.
There are a lot of watches here I really love actually.
I want to take a look at some of those watches, and maybe we can show some now. Well, let's start with, I know that you have a platinum tonneau there, that you previously actually told me that actually it's really where the Cartier story begins. So that intrigues me.
Well, let me. What I'll do is, I think the best way to show this is if I put it on my wrist, actually. But because I'm going to show you some things here, which I find particularly interesting. So there it is on my wrist.
Mm-hmm.
And if I take it off my wrist, you'll see that it's curved to the wrist.
Oh.
And this is made of, but of course it's a beautiful metal.
Right.
It's a kind of a gray, silvery color. So platinum is very
okay.
rare.
So it's platinum. Sorry, Harry. I just have to cut you off for a second there because you actually just cut out while you were speaking about the metal. But it is made of platinum, you said.
Made of platinum. And
okay.
What I was saying before is that Cartier was the first jeweler to use platinum. So platinum was to make a watch case from platinum was complicated. It was very hard. So and there were very few platinum watches. I have 3 or 4 of them here because I really like platinum watches, but they're very rare. But what I'm going to show you from this, and when I say it all begins with this watch, although this watch is actually a 1925 version of the original, which was made in 1920. Track. Can I, if I hold it out, you see the minute track we were talking about before, and you see the sapphire winder. Now, if you walk into Cartier this afternoon, asked to see a Cartier watch. On that Cartier watch today, you will see the same numerals, the same chemin de fer minute track, and the same winder. Now we're looking at a tonneau, which Cartier does not make again today, but if I take this watch, this is what date? This is actually 19. I've got an earlier one. Let's take this. That's 40s. Hold on, I'm trying to find an early watch view here. Well, it doesn't matter. Let's take this one, 1944. Yep. This watch, you see the same thing. So there you are. You've got the same numerals, same chemin de fer, same winder, and what I was saying to you, where it all begun, was Cartier started a trend. For example, this watch, my watch, which they do make again today, which has remained unchanged for 100 years. Now, apart from Marmite, I don't know if you know Marmite, but apart from Marmite, there are very few things in our lives today which have remained fundamentally, totally unchanged since they were invented. And this was invented in 1904. Everything has been modified, everything has been changed. And it's very hard to find where the origin came from. But Cartier designed something in 1904, which remains as fashionable today as it ever did. And that, I think, is extraordinary. I find that one of the most extraordinary facts about Cartier, which doesn't apply to any other watchmaker. Rolex, I believe, I don't know enough about Rolex, but I think Rolex has kept a pretty static view. But this is from 1904.
That's a long time.
And I think that's really quite fascinating.
That is very fascinating. The tonneau, of course, is the second oldest wristwatch, the first being the Santos. But of course, the shapes of the two are very different, right? How do you think that Cartier arrived at such a unique and elegant shape after, the famously square Santos?
What I do know is that when Louis Cartier decided to go into the wristwatch business, he had 2 criteria. One was elegance, and the other, which was connected to elegance, was thinness. And he couldn't find anybody who could make a movement thin enough to fit into the cases, which were already thin because they had to be elegant, until he met up with Mr. Edmund Jaeger. Mr. Edmund Jaeger said, I can make you these thin watch movements. But actually, who was responsible for sitting down with a pen and paper and drawing the Santos? I don't know. The history does not relate. And who decided on this tonneau? And the tonneau is a barrel, is a shape of a barrel.
Right.
And the next one was a tortoise, which is a sort of shape of a tortoise.
Wow.
But then, of course, the tank it comes into a category of its own. But
Yeah.
Cartier had extraordinary designers.
Yep.
And when they turned their hand to anything, whether it be a clock or it be a cigarette case or it be a tiara or a watch, they had extraordinary designers. And so I would just say that it was the extraordinary designers who came up with these shapes.
Great. Actually, now that you mentioned the tank, of course, the one next watch that we're going to show is a tank Centre. And I think the specific model that you're going to show us today is from 1926. And it has Arabic numerals, right?
I'll tell you that. But of course, I mean, everybody now knows the story that the tank, the mechanized tank, was really the instrument of war, which broke the impasse of the trenches. And the first tank, which was made by the Renault Tank Company, and Cartier wanted to celebrate this fact. And you know, when you look down on a tank, you see the big tank tracks, parallel tank tracks, and in every tank watch, you have to have these parallel bars. So I'll pick up the Centre we're going to look at, but I'll just show you this. I don't know if you can see. You see, there's a small watch and a big watch, always with these gold parallel bars. Tank track, tank track, tank track, tank track.
No.
But let's talk about the Centre, because really the Centre, this is the king of Cartier watches. First of all, it is by far the largest watch that Cartier made. I'll hold up another watch side by side. We seem to have lost our. But I want to say to you that one thing that I was trying to say to you before is that on the wrist it looks amazing. And one of the other facts about this is that all Cartier watches had hand-blown crystals. So I don't know if you can see, but there's a little domed effect on the crystal. I don't know if it's apparent, but it makes it very, very charming. And it's one of the some little facts about Cartier watches that people don't really know. But every glass was hand blown. But I just think that, as I say, these are the kings. And to have a watch from 1926, it's completely, everything's here. It's all original. And it has Arabic numerals rather than Roman numerals.
Yeah, I mean, how unique is that? How unique is Arabic versus the
It's
Roman?
very unique. I mean, Cartier was a Roman numeral guy, but he did make watches with Arabic numerals. And funny enough, I've got another Centre here. Okay. This was 26, the first one I showed you. This one is 1952. Okay. And this has also got Arabic numerals. But if you look at 1952, it's not quite as thin as 1926.
I see.
It's just that it just changed a little bit. They had a slightly thicker movement. But this is also a beautiful watch. My God, look at that.
I wonder why it was thicker in the.
I think probably this was post-war. So the two wars, the First World War and Second War, had played a lot of havoc with Cartier and their watchmaking. So this was 1952. So just maybe the batch they got from Switzerland was slightly different, a millimeter or two out, and that's why. But it's still very thin. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
I don't think that's an elegant watch. Huh? Can you see?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah. It looks like it fits under the suit there very well. Despite
it fits on the wrist well. And then here, the last one I have one from 1972. Okay. And 1972, you see the thickness is quite substantially more than the 26.
Right.
And it also has an enamel dial. Okay. But we still have the Roman numerals, the chemin de fer, and the 1904.
Right.
So 1972. This is a beautiful watch. I love this watch. And as I say, I don't really venture too much into the 70s, but once in a blue moon, if I find a watch which I think is really a good example, I do buy it. And I bought this the other day, and I love it.
Fantastic.
So those
let's go further back in time again to 1928 and 29. I think we've got a platinum tank normal that we want to show everybody. Okay. So I think you made a reference to this earlier, right?
As I was saying before, platinum watches from the Cartier stable are very rare. They made the fewest watches were made in platinum, and so to find a platinum tank from 1928 is hard today. I'm
Sure.
not saying it's impossible, but it is very, very hard to find these. And in fact, one of the things I'd like to draw your attention for all of your audience is that if you go on the internet and you put in, I don't know, whatever you want to put in, you can find it, whether you want the new toothpaste or whether you want to buy a vintage Rolls Royce. If you go on the internet and say you want to put in 1929 Cartier Tank Normal in platinum, you won't get it. You won't find it.
Can't find it on the Google, huh?
Very, very, very rare. So basically speaking, we have got the same as my watch, Tank Normal. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you a very quick fact about the Tank Normal versus the Tank JC. Is you will see the Tank JC has a very thin bar of gold at the top.
Right.
The Tank Normal has a fat bar of gold at the top. This was the first model that Cartier made, but this is the second one, which is probably more famous. But let's stick with this watch here. This is a beautiful, beautiful watch. So let's first of all just tick off the numerals, the chemin de fer and the sapphire winder. But this is all to do with aesthetics. A lot of people don't want platinum watches. They want yellow gold. But there are people who only want platinum. I have a guy in America who buys these platinum tanks from me. I don't know how many. I've sold him about 5 in my life. And he said he's got plenty more. So I think he's just obsessed by them. But this is a beautiful, this is a beautiful, very rare and lovely, lovely watch.
I really like the way that it's framed, actually. I mean, when you kind of compare the two, obviously the dial is quite well framed in the sample that you just showed us with the platinum.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you have to remember with the tank, it has to have these parallel bars to make it a tank. And then it's all about simplicity. You really could not make a more simple design than this. But you also got to remember that when they were making this shape, to make a round watch was much easier than to make a square watch, because all movements at the time are round. But all these, even in here, they do have round movements. But it is a framing. It's like having a beautiful painting and having it very, very well framed. You're right. But this is it. When you get to tanks, the frames are all the same. They just vary. Some are longer, some are thinner, some are fatter, some are wider. There aren't that many variations you can go through.
Right.
But this, I think, is just a stunning. And this, of course, has got the D buckle. The D buckle is made naturally a rose gold, and the D itself is in platinum. And the reason why the buckles were made in rose gold was because these have to be springy, and you can't get that spring with platinum. They have to use, or with yellow gold, they have to add a component to make it springy. So all the clasps have this pinky gold color. I don't know if you can see. This is another one. This has got a pinky gold color, but you'll notice that it's a small little.
Well, it's incredibly well thought out. I mean, to even think about that, very interesting. Going a little bit further into the tank journey. We're looking now at a tank with, and I'm totally gonna murder this word. I'm so sorry, but a tank with baton chapters. Did I say that right?
You nailed it, Pablo.
Okay.
Baton. Yeah, that you nailed it. And let's look at why it's called baton.
Yeah. And you said it was modified dial. There's a modified dial, eh?
Well, the modified is really do have a touch of Roman numerals, and then the other ones are just lines, batons. And in fact, this is an early Paris watch from 1944. No chemin de fer. So this actually was preceded that trademark of London. But this, to me, is one of the most beautiful watches. I love this watch, made right at the end of the First World War. I find this so elegant. And I'm going to show you another little quirky thing, which a lot of your Cartier aficionados will know, is you see the lugs here. If I cover this ahead, you just look at this part of the lug, it looks a little bit like a bird's head. I don't know if you can see this. I hope you can see this. And these lugs were known as bec d'aigle, which is eagle's beak. And you can see why, but the purpose of it was it created an illusion that when sitting on your wrist, it is somehow gripping onto your wrist. I have collectors who come to me and say, "Oh, I want watches with eagle beak lugs." Okay, I have watches with eagle beak lugs. I think it's a quirky thing. It to me, it doesn't enhance, but it's just an interesting little feature which I thought I'd point out to you. But look at this watch with this modified dial. I love this.
Question.
I would hate to sell this actually, but I do love this watch. And again, you cannot find this design.
Right.
You cannot find. There's one I have here, which is the same. This actually has gold buttons and gold hands, which is very minimalist. But you see again, this has the eagle beak design. But you see the 4 screws as well.
Yeah.
You see the 4 screws. This was also something which started back in the very early days. And there was no need to have those 4 screws. You could have just had these hold the case together. You could have had a clip case.
Sure.
And these hold the strap in. You could have just had spring bars. But no, Cartier added these 4 screws to create a decorative effect. And they're beautiful. Every watch has them, and they're beautiful. It's another absolute iconic design for Cartier watches.
And Harry, the eagle beak, the word eagle beak, and the term, was that actually coined by the House of Cartier?
Yeah,
or was
you
that...
look in the Cartier archives, and they've made a watch with it says Bec d'Aigle, lugs Bec d'Aigle. So it was a decorative feature.
Made with intent.
Made by Cartier. And listen, it's a little bit like the Rolex market when you have a red dot somewhere, and that wants to buy the eagle beak thing, like that, for looking little quirky things. Not all of them. I mean, none of the JCs have it. The slightly larger ones tend to have it. Just very quickly, this is from '46 as well. This is a lovely elongated tank. You still have the parallel bars. You still have all the normal features, but here is the little Bec d'Aigle lugs. It's a feature to look out for.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, I'm going to be mindful of everybody's time, so we're going to look through a couple more watches here, and then take some questions from the audience. The next watch I see is a jumbo tank automatic. I couldn't murder those words. So I understand that the earlier iterations were pretty small, 24 millimeters in width and 27 millimeters in height. But the one you're going to show us is, well, a jumbo.
Jumbo. You can see a difference in size between the 2 watches, and this brings into play a few things that we've talked about before. So first of all, you can see the increased size. Second of all, you can see all the features we've been talking about before, which makes this a Cartier watch and makes this a Cartier tank watch. And the reason for the size was 2 things. First of all, this was made in the 70s, and there was a tendency in the 70s for watches to be a bit bigger, but that wasn't really the reason why this was made bigger. Cartier had a horror of automatic movements. There are very, very few automatic movements, very few automatic watches until the 70s. And the reason was because the automatic movements had shrunk a little bit, and they managed to incorporate. The reason why they were worried about it was they thought that this big fat movement would destroy the elegance of the tank watch. So with this, you'll see on the back, it has a bubble. And that bubble, it allows them to house the automatic movement in the watch without destroying the elegance of it. And so there on your wrist now is a perfect tank watch, a little bit larger than normal, which people like, they can see the time. It looks super smart, but it's an automatic. So this ties into this whole thing with Cartier and elegance. And he wasn't into horologery. He wasn't making rare movements and especially complicated watches. All his movements were very simple, but he shied away from one of the modern technologies for the sake of elegance. But these watches, they're not so rare, these watches. This you can go on the internet and find, but I really like them. They're really elegant. I think there was a big article written not long ago by Pen and Quill when they explained about actually how rare these jumbo watches are.
Got it. Well, talking about simplicity, I'm gonna end it with what I will call the most simple of them all, the crash. Would you say that would be simple, Harry?
When I think you're ending with a drum roll, because what we were talking about before was how Cartier made this design, made this watch design very, very early on, and how it has remained very consistent. And we've also talked about how London went a little bit off piste and developed their own watches, which were not necessarily tanks. And of course, the sort of cherry on the cake for Cartier London, but really the cherry on the cake for Cartier are these crash watches, because they are such an extraordinary design. So we'll start actually with a picture on the screen, because really that tells it all. Now, there are all sorts of stories about how this watch came about.
Right.
Francesca Brickell has written a book. She's the granddaughter of Jean-Jacques Cartier. She claims this was simply a workshop meeting, and they were fiddling around with the watch, and they said, well, what happens if we pinched it? It would come out. Now, she's a great girl. She knows her stuff incredibly well. I love her. But the story that I prefer is that Jean-Jacques Cartier was going to work one day, and he saw a crash on Bond Street between a taxi and a London bus. And he went into his workshop and he said, I wonder what one of our classic tank watches would look like if it had been in a car crash.
Right.
The designers got to work, and they came up with this design, hence the name Crash. So I think that this is the story that I like, the story that I believe, and it makes sense given the name is the Crash. But really, it has become one of the great icons. When you talk about London in the 60s, you talk about the Mini, you talk about the Beatles, you talk about the E-Type Jaguar, you talk about Mary Quant, Vidal Sassoon. There was a lot going on. And this was really Cartier's contribution to that move. We've talked about how the watch to design was established in Paris, and how it really remained unchanged for many, many years.
Yes.
And then we got to the 1960s. We talked about how Jean-Jacques Cartier made his watches, which were unique to London. And the cherry on the cake, the greatest achievement, was in the creation of this particular design, which has become incredibly famous around the world, and is one of the great icons, one of the great success stories of 20th century watchmaking and design. Mm-hmm. So the question, which you probably missed, which I explained, was how did it come about?
Oh no, we got that. We got to that point. Don't worry, Harry. I'm not going to make you repeat the entire part. Okay. Don't worry. Yes.
So I think
let's take a look. Let's take a closer look now.
I'm lucky enough to have a diamond version from 1991. In 1991, Cartier was making series of watches. This actually was a unique model. It's a one-off. But again, you see the same numerals, same winder, and the same chemin de fer. But they took, to get this dial to work with this crazy design, they had to go through about 1,000 different variations, because to get to tell the time was very complicated. But this is an absolutely stunning watch. It's very expensive. It's a couple of $100,000. But even the buckle is crashed. The buckle's been in a car crash too. But this is a watch which will bring great howls of joy for people who own them. And when you go out in the evening and a lady is wearing this, it will not go uncommented on. And it's an extraordinary piece, extraordinary part of the Cartier story.
Beautiful. Thank you, Harry. Okay, at this point, I'm just going to open it up and read some questions out to you, Harry. Okay. Of course, if there's any more questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, I see one from Elizabeth Lakes. Actually, this is perfect because, it's talking about the Crash. So you say that the Crash itself is not the most beautiful Cartier watch. Which one do you consider to be the most beautiful?
Well, I am fundamentally a tank man.
You're a tank man.
So I would take, I'm a tank man. I love the simplicity of the tank. I mean, I'm not saying that the Crash is not beautiful. That's a little bit mean there. But I mean, for me, I think that the Cartier watch production is really defined by the tank. Uh-huh. The Crash is really the cherry on the cake of all the productivity that Cartier made. And it warrants its position. I don't think in any way, it absolutely warrants its position, because here is a very radical design. It's still an amazing looking watch. It is a beautiful watch. But for me personally, I'm a tank man. So, and also I think these Crashes were, although the original ones were kind of unisex for boys and girls, they are now very much a girl's watch. So that's probably the other reason why I wouldn't turn to a Crash personally, but I'd turn to any one of the tanks.
Fantastic. Now, what would you say would be the most underrated watch, and why?
Underrated watch and why? I don't think that any of the watches are really underrated as such. Okay. I mean, I don't know how I'd say underrated. I could find something to rate every one of these watches. I think by the time they got to the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, when they were really mass producing the watches,
Okay.
I think the quality of the watch went down a little bit, but then they are rated accordingly. But of these handmade watches, I've got nothing. There's not a single one that I would not rate.
Got it. Okay. No problem. I mean, that's true to somebody that completely loves all parts of Cartier. So I understand that.
I'm a little bit biased in the same, but at the same time, I mean, Cartier did make some kind of random watches, and they made some pretty random jewelry as well. Many people come to me and say, "Would you please buy this and buy that?" Is very rare. But the only criteria for me is the same as I said to you earlier. It's about beauty.
Yep.
Which are very varied, and I have a watch here from 1980. I'll just show you the reason why I have this. Look how thin that is. That's like a chocolate. It's a after 8 mint. It's absolutely amazing. Made in 1980, so it's not an old watch, and looks a little bit like the Santos. But I couldn't get over how thin it was, and I thought it was beautiful, so I bought it. So that is still the bottom line criteria for me.
Understood. Okay, I've got a question from Miguel, and he's asking, what's your opinion on the? Okay, I'm going to murder this word again. I'm so sorry, Miguel. What is your opinion on the tank divan? I don't know how to say it.
Sure what the tank divan is. I'm not even sure what it is. I think the problem is that once it gets into these modern watches, I don't buy them, I don't sell them,
Gotcha.
and I'm not really sure. I think all the things. I'm really sorry, Miguel. I actually can't answer that question. But if it was made by Cartier, it's probably a pretty nice watch.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I heard you. I know you hate the word collectible and collectors, but somebody is asking specifically about the metal. What do you think which metal do you think is the most collectible for vintage Cartiers? We've talked about platinums. We've spoken a little bit about.
There really only are two metals. There's either yellow gold or platinum. There was nothing else. I mean, there are a couple of silver watches, but they're super rare. But fundamentally, you either have yellow gold or you have platinum. The problem is that you will not find platinum versions of all the yellow gold versions. I don't believe, for example, here is the famous Tonque Chinoise. Now, so far as I know, the Tonque Chinoise was only made in yellow gold.
Right.
So you can't say I want a platinum Tonque Chinoise. So you are limited. I think that my personal thing is that I would like to have one of each. I'd like to have a platinum watch and a yellow gold watch. And because the platinum, I mean, for example, if you're going to wear blue jeans and hang out in a t-shirt in a strange way, this is probably more cool than a yellow gold watch. I mean, this is very subjective. This is me talking. But then it's but then you go out in the evening in black tie and you wear a platinum watch. It's very hard. This, by the way, is a platinum watch, and this, amazingly enough, I'm going to put this on for you. It's got the original band. This is from 1925. This is very early. You see again, we have all the classic features, but this was a man's watch.
Oh wow!
Put it on now. I mean, I actually sell it. It fits me just. Yeah. But in 1920s. To have a small watch was like having a small iPhone. Like it was very, very elegant, very cutting edge to have a small watch.
Of course,
and so men wearing watches like this, it was super modern and super cool. And I actually think this is fine enough. I mean, would I wear this? I might if I was really in the mood. But I'm selling it as a ladies' watch now.
Okay.
But anyhow, so I think in terms of metal, that's the only options you have is yellow gold or platinum.
What's interesting is that you putting on that watch actually leads to this great next question. So Alexei Villaraza asks, can the smallest tank be worn by men too?
Women were definitely men's back in the day, and men were proud to wear them. And I mean, I've got a client in America. He's a big, quite a large guy, and he only wears ladies' watches. I mean, what I would call ladies' watches now, small Cartier watches. They look fabulous on it. He always has kind of cool leather bands, and that's the size he likes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Let me see here. Let me look at some questions here.
We're back on. I have a sign saying we're back on.
I believe we are back on. Are we back on, everybody? We're back on. Fantastic. Okay. So that was the most unique and special piece that I'm so glad we showed everybody, Harry. I'm just joking.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, I mean, as I said, we've looked at practically all these watches here. I'll show you just one quick one, which is quite fun to see, which was made in the war years, 1942. And as you can imagine, 1942 was the middle of the war. Paris was occupied.
Wow,
so this was a watch, very military looking. You see, it's got very different numerals, these daggered numerals. And find out if I have the original ad from it showing the very same watch, which is quite fun. And then just very quickly before you go, here is a watch which I love, which is a 1970 jewel time for the jet set who was emerging at that time. It was the beginning of the jet set and people were going all over the world. And this is a great Cartier watch. This.
It's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay.
You got more questions?
Yeah, we do have more questions actually. Oh, this one's my favorite. This does refer to Kanye West. Is it true? Is it true that Kanye West actually bought a Cartier from you? And if so, can you share what it was?
Well, actually, I can't really, because it would be breaching my client's privilege.
What if I asked you if it was Kanye West?
But
could you tell us if it was?
Closely, if you look very closely behind me in my bookshelf, you would see a picture of Kanye West. And you might ask yourself, why the hell has he got a picture of Kanye West in his bookshelf? But let me tell you that if he did buy a crash watch and he bought another crash watch for his wife. And I think that if you are in the world and you are looking for a pair of Cartier crash watches, there's not many places you're going to go to find someone who's going to do those. So if you can mash all that up and together and look for an answer, you're probably going to get the right answer.
I wonder if we could actually, so we can Google an image of Mr. West wearing a Cartier. Like if we Googled.
Yeah, Google, there are plenty of pictures of him wearing his crash and with his, I think she's his ex-wife now, with Kim Kardashian wearing hers. We got plenty of pictures.
Fantastic. I'll just go through a couple more.
I have to be a bit careful because we have quite a few interesting people who buy watches, but we're very discreet here. So
sure, of course, that makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, you hold a lot of vintage pieces. Somebody asks, Johan Bona is asking, how do you maintain a vintage tank? I mean, do you actually send it to Cartier for servicing, or yeah?
We send it to Cartier for servicing. But the thing which is quite nice about Cartier watches is that fundamentally the movements were very straightforward. They were all Jaeger-LeCoultre movements, and absolutely accurately, as I said, mine loses about 4 minutes a day.
Right.
It's like having an old car. But they are pretty resilient. We recommend to all of our clients that if they buy a watch from us, that they send it back to us after a couple of years to be maintained and serviced. We do that at cost price. We don't add any extras on.
Mm-hmm.